October 25th, 1944. Off the coast of Samar Island, Philippines. Dawn broke in bruised colors, gray, violet, and the deep crimson of a rising sun caught behind clouds of cordite. The sea was restless, a steel-blue expanse cut by the wakes of tiny, stubby ships racing eastward. On the deck of USS Gambier Bay, CVE 73, 24-year-old Ensign Jack Yunker leaned over the catwalk rail, squinting into the wind. Below, the flight deck crew was strapping down FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers, aircraft far lighter and slower than the sleek Hellcats and Corsairs flying off the fleet carriers hundreds of miles away. The Gambier Bay was part of Task Unit 77.4.3, better known by its radio call sign, Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Their job was humble but vital. Provide close air support for the amphibious troops landing at Leyte Gulf. The Jeep carriers, as the men jokingly called them, were essentially merchant hulls with a flat deck welded on top, a flight deck 512 feet long, thin armor, and engines that barely managed 19 knots on a good day. Sailors in the Pacific Fleet used to laugh about them. "Those things are floating paper," one cruiser officer sneered. "One good hit and they'll fold in half." And he wasn't wrong. The CVEs weren't built to fight surface battles. They were meant to carry spare planes, ferry supplies, and provide air patrol, not trade broadsides with battleships. Yet on this morning, Gambier Bay and her sisters, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and St. Lo, would face the unthinkable. As dawn mist lifted, radar screens aboard Taffy 3 flickered with ghostly shapes, dozens of them, closing fast from the northwest. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding from Fanshawe Bay, adjusted his binoculars and froze. Through the gray haze, he could make out the silhouettes. Battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, the entire Japanese center force, led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, had somehow slipped past the main American fleet. Among them loomed the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, 72,000 tons of steel, bristling with 18-inch guns capable of hurling a shell the size of a small car over 20 miles. Sprague's voice came over the radio, tight but calm. "All units, this is Taffy 3. Enemy fleet bearing 015, range 20 miles. Commence evasive action. Launch all aircraft." The sailors stared in disbelief. Paper ships were about to face the iron fist of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Engines roared to life along Gambier Bay's narrow deck. The air stank of exhaust and hot steel as deck crews sprinted to ready every aircraft they could muster. Lieutenant Robert Copeland, commanding the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, looked through his binoculars and muttered, "God Almighty, they're coming straight for us." Kurita's armada advanced in textbook formation. Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna leading a line of cruisers and destroyers that stretched to the horizon. Their massive guns elevated, turning like predatory eyes toward the tiny silhouettes of Taffy 3. The distance closed fast. 20 miles, 15, 10. At a 6:45, a column of orange fire erupted from Yamato's forward turrets. The first salvo screamed across the sky. 1-ton shells slicing through the clouds, their descent marked by a low, bone-shaking whistle. Moments later, water plumes exploded around Gambier Bay, towering higher than her flight deck. Metal rained down like shrapnel. Hard starboard, shouted her helmsman. The carrier heeled violently, her wooden deck groaning under stress. Below, sailors and engineering could feel each detonation as a punch through their rib cages. Admiral Sprague's orders crackled over the TBS radio. "Launch all planes. Attack immediately. Use anything you have." Aboard Gambier Bay, the first TBM Avenger, piloted by Lieutenant Paul R. White, thundered down the deck and lifted into the morning haze, its bomb bay loaded with 100-pound depth charges, the only ordnance available. He didn't hesitate. "Hell, maybe we'll scratch their paint," he quipped over the radio before diving toward a Japanese cruiser. Soon, the sky above Samar was a chaos of arcs and contrails. Wildcats and Avengers darted between geysers of anti-aircraft fire, diving again and again on ships that dwarfed them 100-fold. They carried depth charges, machine gun bullets, and pure nerve, and somehow it was working. Japanese lookouts aboard the cruiser, Chokai shouted warnings as bombs splashed perilously close. The ship's captain, furious, ordered full speed ahead. Kurita himself, aboard his flagship Yamato, hesitated. His maps told him these were fleet carriers, not escort carriers. American deception and courage blurred the lines of logic. Meanwhile, on the sea's surface, the destroyers turned to fight. "Flank speed," barked Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, captain of USS Johnston, DD 557. "We're going in." His helmsman blinked. "Sir, that's a battleship line." "I know," Evans replied, his jaw set. "We'll lay smoke and draw their fire." Johnston's turbines screamed as she accelerated to full throttle, 34 knots, charging headlong into a storm of steel. Her 5-inch guns began barking, their shells spattering harmlessly against armored hulls but buying precious seconds for the carriers to flee eastward. Then came the torpedoes, 10 fish in the water, streaking toward the Japanese column. 2 found their mark. The cruiser Kumano shuddered as an explosion tore off her bow. Smoke billowed high, black against the silver sea. Evans was already turning for another run when shrapnel ripped through his bridge. Blood spattered the glass. He wiped it away with his sleeve and kept fighting. Overhead, the Wildcats made strafing runs so low their wingtips skimmed the waves. Pilots called out targets in frantic bursts. Enemy cruiser turning starboard, taking hits, going back in. Out of ammo, still diving. Every man knew this wasn't about victory. It was about survival. But the longer they fought, the more disbelief rippled through Kurita's command staff. One officer aboard Yamato was heard exclaiming, "These Americans are madmen. They're attacking battleships with toy planes." Yes, they were. And it was working. At 07:15 hours, the Battle of Samar had devolved into chaos. A brawl of smoke, blood, and miracles. Gambier Bay was zigzagging wildly, her flight deck slick with oil and seawater, while the destroyers ahead formed a living shield. USS Hole, Heermann, and Samuel B. Roberts surged forward like wolves against a storm. Their captains knew they were outmatched in every metric: size, speed, firepower, but none of that mattered now. They could see the flashes from Japanese gun muzzles miles away, hear the distant rumble of their salvos like thunder rolling across the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, his face pale beneath a smear of soot, barked another order aboard Johnston. "Range 8,000 yards. Fire all guns." Johnston's 5-inch batteries erupted in a rolling barrage. The shells struck the heavy cruiser Chokai, shattering her upper decks and igniting ammunition stores. When the destroyer's torpedoes followed, the Japanese cruiser vanished behind a wall of water and flame. Evans didn't live long enough to see the full effect. A direct hit from a 14-inch shell tore through Johnston's hull, flooding her engine room. Still, she fought on. Sailors passed shells by hand as the ship listed hard to port. Her guns kept barking until her bow disappeared beneath the waves. On the bridge of Yamato, Admiral Kurita stared through his binoculars in disbelief. He'd expected an easy slaughter, not a swarm of small ships charging suicidally into his formation. "These are not fleet carriers," one officer murmured. "They're escorts." Kurita frowned. "If they're escorts, where are the main carriers?" Doubt crept in, the worst enemy of any commander. Reports came in rapid succession. Kumano crippled, Chokai burning, Suzuya hit by aircraft, and Yamato herself forced to evade torpedoes. The Japanese flagship turned hard to avoid another attack, temporarily throwing the fleet into disarray. Meanwhile, the jeep carriers continued launching whatever aircraft they could. Gambier Bay's deck crews pushed damaged planes overboard to make room for new takeoffs. Smoke poured from her stacks. Every available pilot, even those with barely half a fuel load, took off, heading straight into the inferno. Lieutenant Harold Buell, in his FM-2 Wildcat, climbed to 10,000 feet and looked down at the scene below. Columns of Japanese battleships firing in all directions, white wakes of destroyers weaving between plumes of water, and the small, wounded silhouettes of his own ships fighting for their lives. He keyed his mic. "Boys, this is it. Let's make them think the whole damn U.S. Navy is here." Avengers dove from the clouds, their tiny bombs splashing close enough to rattle even Yamato's massive hull. Pilots strafed bridge decks, dropped flares, even tossed smoke grenades to confuse enemy rangefinders. Then, as if to answer Buell's call, the sea exploded in chaos anew. Torpedo wakes from Hirman, the last destroyer standing, slicing toward the Japanese line. Two hit home. The cruiser Chikuma staggered, listing hard. The Japanese counterfire was furious. Gambier Bay, lagging behind the formation, became an easy mark. At 8:50, a salvo from Yamato's forward battery landed squarely astern. The carrier shuddered, flames engulfing her hangar. Men scrambled across her deck, some jumping into the oily water below. Within minutes, the proud little ship began to roll onto her side. Signalman Second Class Edgar Fox, clutching a life ring, looked back one last time. "She fought like a lion," he whispered. By Euro 907, USS Gambier Bay disappeared beneath the waves, the only U.S. carrier ever sunk by naval gunfire. But her sacrifice had bought precious time. The Japanese formation was now scattered, bleeding, and confused. Kurita, convinced he faced the main U.S. fleet, gave the unthinkable order: retreat. By mid-morning, the sea off Samar was a graveyard, dotted with oil fires, drifting rafts, and the shattered remains of ships that had no right to be fighting battleships in the first place. Yet amid the wreckage, courage still pulsed through the waves. The survivors of Gambier Bay floated in the burning slick, clutching life jackets and bits of debris. Overhead, the drone of Wildcats and Avengers still echoed. Not in retreat, but in defiance. Admiral Kurita stood on the bridge of Yamato, his uniform flecked with soot. He had watched his fleet hammer the Americans for nearly 3 hours, and yet, somehow, victory felt hollow. Reports streamed in: Chikuma crippled and sinking, Chokai abandoned, Suzuya exploding after an air attack. His battleships had burned thousands of shells and gallons of fuel, but the enemy, the paper ships, refused to die quietly. Kurita turned to his staff. "We have achieved surprise, yet the enemy fights with the strength of 10 fleets. What if this is only their advance guard?" The doubt was contagious. Japanese lookouts still spotted fresh waves of aircraft circling above, mistaking the relentless sorties from Taffy 2 and Taffy 1. Other escort carrier groups operating nearby for reinforcements from Admiral Halsey's main force. The illusion was complete. At 0911, Kurita made his fateful decision: He ordered the fleet to turn north, away from the invasion beaches at Leyte, away from the vulnerable American transports, away from certain victory. The order rippled through the Japanese formation with disbelief and relief alike. Gunners ceased fire, and sailors aboard Yamato cheered, not for triumph, but for survival. They had never imagined that these small, slow ships could bleed them so deeply. Miles to the south, the remnants of Taffy 3 barely registered what was happening. The surviving escort carriers, still under fire, continued eastward, streaming smoke and chaos behind them. It was only when radar operators noticed the enemy blips receding that the realization set in. "Sir, they're turning away," a young ensign shouted aboard Fanshawe Bay. Admiral Clifton Sprague lowered his binoculars and exhaled for the first time in hours. "I'll be damned," he murmured. "They're breaking off." He keyed his radio. "All units, cease evasive action. Form up if you can. God bless those destroyers." No one cheered. The decks were littered with wounded, the air thick with the smell of fuel and blood. Ships were aflame or dead in the water. But they had survived, against every law of naval warfare and every line of logic. Beneath the waves, Johnston and Samuel B. Roberts lay silent. Survivors from both ships would later recount the same words shouted by their captains before the end. "This is a fight against impossible odds, but we'll make them remember." And remember, they did. Hours later, as night fell and rescue operations began, Admiral Sprague looked out across the black water. He knew history would never believe this, that a handful of jeep carriers and destroyers had driven off the mightiest battleship fleet ever assembled. In the distance, burning wrecks still flickered like candles, Gambier Bay among them. Sprague's final dispatch to command was brief and understated and immortal. "We were attacked by a major portion of the Japanese fleet and are retiring eastward under continuous fire. The enemy is withdrawing. The outcome is doubtful. But the courage of my men is beyond all praise." October 26th, 1944. Dawn over the Philippine Sea. The sun rose over an ocean still streaked with oil and debris. Dozens of life rafts drifted in silence, filled with burned, exhausted men who had faced the unimaginable and somehow lived. The wind carried the smell of cordite and salt, the scent of both victory and mourning. Aboard the destroyer USS Dennis, now acting as rescue ship, medics hauled in survivors from the oily water, men from Gambier Bay, Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts. Many were too weak to speak. Some clutched waterlogged photos or fragments of life jackets marked with the names of their ships. One sailor, eyes barely open, whispered to a corpsman, "Did we stop them?" The medic nodded. "You did, son. You damn well did." Back in Japan, the shock reverberated through Naval Command. The reports from Kurita's fleet were confused and humiliating. He had turned back from victory, believing he faced the entire U.S. Third Fleet, when in truth, only a handful of escort carriers and destroyers stood before him. Within weeks, Japan's naval power in the Pacific was effectively broken. Leyte Gulf had cost them 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and more than 10,000 sailors. The so-called paper ships, the mockery of the Imperial Navy, had helped shatter the backbone of Japan's fleet. Historians would later call it the Battle of Samar, a sub-battle of the greater Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in human history. But to the men who fought there, it was simply survival. In Washington, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the first after-action reports in silence. The room was still when he finally spoke. This will be remembered as one of the most heroic actions in naval history. The story of Taffy 3 spread quickly across the fleet. Crews began calling the destroyers and destroyer escorts tin cans, a name first spoken as a joke, then as a badge of honor. In letters home, sailors wrote of ships so thin you could punch through the hull, yet manned by men made of iron. At sea, memorials held months later, the roll call of the fallen echoed across flight decks. Gambier Bay, Johnston, Howell, Samuel B. Roberts. Each name carried the same silent truth, that courage is not measured in tonnage or armor plate. Among the survivors was Lieutenant Harold Buell, the Wildcat pilot who had led his last sortie with empty guns. Standing on the deck of Fanshawe Bay, he stared out at the horizon and said softly, "They called us the smallest fleet in the Navy. I reckon we showed them how big small can be." Today, the wrecks of the Johnston and Gambier Bay rest over 20,000 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea, among the deepest war graves on Earth. In 2021, explorers finally confirmed Johnston's identity, her bow still upright, her guns aimed defiantly toward the direction she once charged. The brass letters on her hull remain legible through the darkness. They read, Johnston DD 557, and nearby, the shattered steel of Gambier Bay still lies quiet, her decks torn but unbowed, the ship that proved mockery wrong. When the Japanese sailors had first called them paper ships, it was meant as an insult. But after Samar, it meant something else. Paper, fragile, unarmored, unassuming, can still cut like a blade.